Hello everyone, if you're new to my channel, consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do that. Thanks. By the way, I also have another Naruto and Luffy fanfiction channel. If you are interested, link is in the description.
Rumble Rumble No Luffy by Mysterium Tremendum. At a young age, Luffy ate the logia type goro no mi and began his journey to become the pirate king. With power, however, how would Luffy change history? Big shout out to the warlords of this channel. Rodarius Jones, Native Warrior, Claude Lifrace, Neo Wesker 23, Derek Dowdy, Zazu Sayaz, Abdul Raf Ali, N3WT, What If Lord, Black Money Young Leon, Garrick Russell, Case Clark, KSGPL4YZ, Brian McKenzie. You know who you are. Want to stand with them? Join the channel membership and show your support. Adios.
The night breeze on Fuchsia Island blew gently throughout the thick of the dense forest. The leaves rustled lightly while the shadows danced to and fro amidst the beauty of the glowing full moon. In the middle of a small clearing in the deepest parts of the jungle, surrounded by towering trees, a little boy with short black hair, clad in a torn white shirt and short blue trousers, lay collapsed on the cold hard ground. Baka Jii-chan. 1. Cried out the 6.5-year-old monkey D. Luffy. Why did he have to throw me into this stupid jungle? Luffy stayed on the ground fuming at his troublesome elder as the stars sparkled brightly amidst the darkness of the night. A loud grumbling noise broke Luffy's rant, twisting Luffy's face into a pained expression. I'm hungry. I haven't eaten in hours. Those mushrooms I ate a few hours ago didn't last long. Luffy held his hand to his stomach with his tongue hanging from his mouth. Luffy rose slowly and looked around for a few seconds. There must be something I can eat around here, Luffy thought while he scanned the area he'd stopped at. He didn't recognize the clearing and that he couldn't find the way that he'd come. With no idea where he was, Luffy shrugged and set off further into the depths of the forest in search of food. Luffy wandered through the dark and foreboding forest for several minutes, scanning the dark, shadowy surroundings for anything he could eat. His stomach groaning loudly while Luffy held his hand to his stomach and continued searching and walked further into the forest, remembering how he'd ended up in such a place. Flashback. Luffy, you're going to be a marine, the ever-eccentric Garp the Fist said with confidence as he pointed dramatically at the entrance to the deepest forest on Fuchsia Island, while Luffy sat cross-legged beside him, the shadow of the forest looming over them. The sun on Fuchsia Island bathed the island in a rich golden light as it slowly set over the horizon. Luffy stared at the forest oddly before turning his gaze to his troublesome elder. But Jii-chan, I want to be a pirate. Why do you keep trying to make me a marine and what are we doing here? Luffy answered and stubbornly crossed his arms over his chest, pouting at Garp. Luffy always hated how his Jii-chan kept trying to get him to become a marine. Garp the Fist, however, would not yield to his stubborn grandson. You will become the strongest marine, even if I have to throw you back into that ravine 100 times to ensure it. Garp exclaimed as he grabbed Luffy and lifted him up to face level by the scruff of his shirt. Luffy struggled against the powerful grip. You wouldn't? Garp smiled widely. I would. And it is why you will be spending a few nights in this forest. A marine must always be ready to withstand hardship in the name of duty. Now. Garp wound his arm back as Luffy yelped and struggled, withstand it. With a large yelp, Luffy was thrown into the depths of the forest. He rolled and turned, bouncing in the dirt and finally sliding to an abrupt stop as he rolled upside down and slammed into a large tree. Gritting his teeth, Luffy slumped down on top of his head, dazed. Regaining his composure, Luffy rubbed his head and dusted himself off. Amidst angry mutterings, Luffy before walking straight down the path, further into the forest. End flashback. Luffy's thoughts snapped back and he continued walking through dark forest, looking for mushrooms, or anything that he could eat. He scanned the sides of the dirt road when a sudden rustle of leaves came from a nearby bush, startling Luffy. He shakily turned his head towards the disturbance. The rustling quieted after a second, but it made Luffy more than a little anxious to find out what had caused it. Slowly and silently, he crept toward the sound and reached his hand into the thick brush of leaves. His hand wandered through the mass of leaves until it rubbed against something hard and bony, causing Luffy to voice out a small, "Hey?" until he grabbed the object and pulled it. The object didn't budge at Luffy's tug. Furling his eyebrows, Luffy pulled on it again but to no avail. Frustrated, Luffy kicked the inside of the bushes with his foot until it struck something hard. Luffy yelped in surprise as a boar about as large as Luffy himself suddenly rushed out from the bushes. Luffy grabbed onto one of its tusks as it rushed by and further into the dark forest. Luffy hung on to the boar's tusks as the entire forest wished past him in a complete blur. They raced on for several minutes, Luffy holding on to the young boar's tusks, yelling loudly until the boar slammed into a wayward tree. The impact sent Luffy's small body rolling across the ground into a nearby tree while the boar's tusk lodged into the trunk of the tree. Luffy groaned as the impact jarred his small body, causing his vision to go blurry. Before he passed out, Luffy caught sight of a large body of water lurking just beyond the wraith-like trees. It was a little while before Luffy came to. His eyes opened slowly as his vision returned. Although blurry, he began to make out the large tree with holes in it where the boar had crashed into, as well as the rising dawn that lingering over the horizon. Luffy's nose suddenly caught a strong whiff of sea salt and he dazedly got to his feet, and turned around slowly as the beach he'd seen before caught his eye. Dizzily, Luffy lumbered down the slope overshadowed by the thick trees that separated him from the sight of the vast ocean with his eyes half opened and his vision blurry. His stomach growled loudly as the smell of salt enticed him further down the slope toward the ocean. A few minutes later, Luffy gazed out into the vast ocean as the salty wind reminded his stomach of food and caused it to grumble loudly. Still a little dazed, Luffy moved his head from left to right, looking over at the sandy coast while waves gently crashed down upon the beach. A minute passed where Luffy just examined the coastline and his vision slowly began to return while his drowsiness and fatigue subsided. With his vision becoming clearer, Luffy turned his head when he heard a slight noise off in the distance and stopped when he saw a small object lying on the sand a few feet from him. His eyes snapped open as he further gazed at the small object and his brain began to work again. The object was a small fruit, covered in squiggly marks as if someone had drawn on it with a thin marker and shaped like a bushel of blue-colored grapes. It also had a wavy green stem coming out of the top. As soon as Luffy's brain registered this, a large grin appeared across his face. He dashed over the sand, yelling, "Food!" at the top of his lungs and swiftly grabbed up the small fruit. Opening his mouth wide, he swallowed a large bite and continued to eat ravenously, even though the vile taste of it nearly had him gagging on it. Despite the horrid taste, however, Luffy viciously gobbled up the fruit within a matter of seconds. Swallowing the last of it, Luffy slumped to the ground as his hunger subsided marginally. He lay down on the ground for a few minutes while the rising sun slowly started to coat the sky in a magnificent hue of bright orange. Smiling brightly as the sun began to rise, Luffy stood up and promptly headed back into the forest for the final day. The day passed uneventfully. He hunted for food when he was hungry and chased wild animals whenever he felt like it or found some other distraction until the next morning when he was scheduled to leave the forest. Luffy walked down the forest path, where he saw Garp sleeping soundly up against a large tree. Luffy quietly tiptoed up to his grandfather and looked at him curiously. His nose bubble blowing from his nose while drool spilled out from his mouth. Luffy waved a hand in front of his face before deciding to wake him up. "G-chan, wake up." Luffy shook Garp's shoulders slightly, but received no response. Agitated, Luffy shook harder, and when that still produced, he frowned at the old man and kicked him as hard as he could. This time though, Garp lunged an unconscious fist forward. The fist hit Luffy hard in the face, sending him flying across the grassy plain. Garp blinked for a few seconds while the sleepiness cleared away. His eyes widened when he saw Luffy lying down a few meters away. Garp's anger raged and he promptly marched up to his grandson and grabbed him by the scruff of his shirt. "Luffy, this is no time to be sleeping," he shouted and shook Luffy roughly before striking him hard on the back of his head with his hard fist. "Ouch, G-chan, why did you do that?" Luffy complained, waking up while Garp stood clutching him by his shirt and staring at him with an angry expression. "This isn't the time to be asleep. Navy Marines must be awake 24/7 and be constantly aware of their surroundings," Garp exclaimed loudly. "But you were asleep, Jii-chan," Luffy began before he was interrupted. I was not asleep. I was awake the entire time I was waiting for you, Garp exclaimed, shaking Luffy by his shirt while he hung down like a limp rag. Angry at his grandson, Garp held his fist out and once again struck Luffy in the back of the head with his patented fist of love. The bumps on his head burned and thumped as Garp continued to rant. Luffy tried to struggle to be released from Garp's clutch and grasped his grandfather's fist to push off. Something ran through his hand. A strange feeling that Luffy couldn't describe that seemed to flow from his palm. It tingled a bit before something happened that astounded Luffy. Sparks began to emit from his hand in the corner of his eye. Garp's loud rant ceased and he began flash a bright yellow light, making odd noises and moving in an odd manner while Luffy remained unharmed, staring at him while still in his clutch. BWAH, ah. Garp yelled out as electricity continued to flow from Luffy's hand. The flashing stopped when Luffy removed his hand. Garp collapsed to the ground, briefly unconscious while Luffy sat down on the ground, staring at his right hand with a growing fascination. What was that? Luffy whispered silently to himself. A strange fruit with squiggly markings that tasted horrible, Garp said, when Luffy finished recounting his tale about the horrible tasting fruit he'd eaten while in the forest. Garp sat by the tree, his skin slightly burnt and smelling a little bit like he'd been smoking from his outfit getting charred. He looked over at his grandson, a look of seriousness plastered over his face. And you say you found it lying on the beach on the other side of the forest? Garp said to another nod from Luffy. An air of silence filled the space between the two as Garp sat up against the tree, glaring intensely into the distance. In truth, Garp was overjoyed at this new development. Now it must be his absolute priority to make Luffy into a marine. With the devil's fruit in his training, Luffy will undoubtedly be the strongest marine in history. It puzzled him how Luffy had gotten the fruit, but Garp began to smile widely as his desire to make Luffy a top-class marine flared up once again. They're called a devil fruits. They're known as legendary fruits that grant whoever eats them a great power, at the cost of never being able to swim again. Garp said calmly while Luffy gave a large smile to it. Really, what power do I have then? Luffy nearly jumped for joy. Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves. It's odd that you found one here in the first place. Devil fruits are usually native to the Grand Line, but we're in the farthest part of East Blue. He stared intensely at Luffy. I wonder how it wound up on the shore. Garp scratched his head, Garp thought for another second, picking his nose and staring at Luffy, before deciding to raise his hands above his head. Oh well, it doesn't matter now. All that matters now is finding out what type you are. Garp said with excitement in his voice and a wide smile on his face. Luffy pulled his finger from his nose to stare questioningly at Garp. Type? Garp nodded his head. Yes, there are 3 different types of devil fruit. Zone, Paramecia, and Logia. Garp held out 3 fingers for Luffy and counted down for each of them. Zones have the power to turn into animals. Paramecia gain a superhuman ability like being able to stretch themselves or causing objects to levitate. And Logia are able to turn into a distinct element, granting them invulnerability to attacks as well as complete control of their element. The 3 most powerful men in the Navy are Logia fruit users. Garp finished while Luffy calmly stared at him. Garp picked his ear with his little finger before turning away from Luffy to put his hand under his chin in a rare moment of thought. I don't think there are any zone fruits that can generate electricity like you did, unless you're one of the special ones. So that leaves Paramecia and Logia. The chance of this being a Logia fruit however is extremely low, so I doubt it. They're the second rarest type of fruit available, so that leaves Paramecia. Garp walked off towards the nearest town while Luffy ran close behind. Bang, sound. Perhaps I should have thought, thinking, O end of author's note O, Garp sat in an empty Makino's bar, poring over a book while Makino stood behind the bar cleaning wine glasses. Luffy sat on the other end of the bar, feasting on a large plate of meat. Makino took a moment to stare at Garp turning the page once again in the strange book he'd brought with him. It was odd to Makino that Garp hadn't ordered anything since he arrived. All he did was sit down and flip through pages of that book. For the eccentric Garp, that wasn't quite odd since he usually ordered a large amount of food whenever he set foot in the bar. Curiosity was starting to get the better of Makino, so she walked out from behind the bar and silently stepped up behind Garp and peered over his shoulder. Makino couldn't make out the words, but one of the pages of the book Garp was reading had two pictures of strange-looking fruits on it. One resembled a purple watermelon, another a small blue apple, and Makino couldn't identify the fruit on the next page. One thing though was common in all three of them, however. S-shaped squiggles. Garp turned the page, and the next three had even weirder pictures, but the squiggles on the fruit still remained. Makino withdrew her head and smiled lightly as she asked, "What are you looking at?" Garp yelped as the sudden voice startled him, causing his eyes to bug out. He almost fell off the seat at the table, but was able to recover quickly by grasping the chair. "Don't sneak up on me like that," Garp loudly scolded Makino, while the latter sweat dropped. Luffy turned his head towards the pair, his mouth stuffed to the brim with meat, but turned back to his meal a second later when he realized nothing interesting was going on while Garp went back to his book. "I was just asking what you were reading since you've been very quiet since you walked in here." Makino gave an uneven smile. I was just reading this book I asked Sengoku to send to me that arrived today," Garp said, returning to his stout self while Makino picked up the book. "The Encyclopedia of Devil Fruits written by Doc Vegapunk," Makino read aloud. "I've heard a few myths about devil fruits from a few people that come in here from time to time, but I didn't think that they actually existed," said Makino. Garp grabbed the book back and immediately set the book back on the table. "You and pretty much everyone else in East Blue. Devil fruits are a little more common in the Grand Line than in the Blues," Garp said while turning the page once again. "A few days ago, Luffy found one while he was wandering the forest and ate it. I'm trying to find it in this book so I'll know what it does," Garp said with his eyes running over the words on the next page. Makino sat down at the small table while Garp's eyes continued to move ceaselessly. "What are you trying to find out about it? Surely a small book doesn't have all there is to know about them." Makino spoke conversationally. Garp took a second to raise an eye from his book at Makino. "Well," Garp explained to Makino the differences between zone, paramecia, and logia fruits, while Makino sat down at the table listening to Garp's every word, distant munching coming from Luffy across the bar. "I'm trying to figure out what devil fruit Luffy ate. I've ruled out zone fruits, and I've read through almost the entire paramecia section. I've read about an electromagnetism paramecia, but nothing that could create pure electricity and shock me like Luffy did. Logia fruits are too rare to be found in East Blue, especially on an island like this. A logia fruit of electricity would be exceptionally powerful, and to find one here is almost impossible. I even tried looking it up in the logia section, but there was nothing on it." Garp finished staring intensely at Makino. Gingerly, Makino picked up the book Garp had been reading and scanned through the logia section. True to Garp's word, she couldn't find a single trace of a logia that could become and control electricity. Just as she was about to put the book back down on the table, her gazing eyes spotted an oddity on the last page of the book. Staring at the page, she turned towards Luffy, who was still munching on the large amount of food that Makino had prepared for him. "Luffy," she called out. Luffy turned towards her, a rather large slab of meat hanging from his mouth. Makino held the book in her hands and spoke calmly after Luffy swallowed. "Describe the strange fruit that you said you found on the beach a few days ago." Makino kindly, while Garp sat with his arms crossed over his chest and also staring at Luffy. Luffy gulped down the last piece of meat that had been on the table and pushed his index finger to his chin. His expression changed and his eyes danced with strained effort as Luffy dragged the image of the fruit from the dark depths of his mind. It was large, blue, and looked like a bushel of grapes. It also had squiggly markings all over it. Luffy said as his hand traced a squiggle in the air. "It also tasted horribly bitter." Luffy responded with his tongue sticking out, recalling the taste of the horrible fruit. Garp crossed his arms and looked at Makino curiously. "What is she getting at?" Garp stared back at Luffy and habitually stuck his pinky finger up his nose for a second. "Did it look a lot like this?" Makino held the book out for Luffy to see the page. That was when Garp's jaw dropped, his eyes bulged out of his head, and snot dripped from his nose. "No, she couldn't have." Garp thought while Luffy stared at the picture for a second. Yeah, that's the one." Luffy smiled widely while Garp's jaw nearly broke the table to drop even lower. Makino smiled kindly. Yeah, I thought it was. Makino looked at the picture in the book. It matched Luffy's description perfectly. The small title at the top of the page was written in bold text, so even though the book itself was moderately old edition, Makino could make out the words. The Goro no Mi. Makino spoke to herself. Wow, seems like it has quite some power. Makino said with a small amount of awe. At that moment, Garp broke from his shock-induced stupor and seized the book from Makino's light grasp. His hands shook as he read through the text at rapid speed. B-U-H. How did you? His brain nearly collapsing with delight as he read the description at light speed in his head. Makino gave a small victory smile. It was stuck to the last page in the book. You were missing it. Makino said. The words that struck Garp the hardest were the words logia class and electricity. As Garp finished the last few words of the description, his joy and delight were unparalleled. The picture matched Luffy's first description of the fruit to him perfectly. It even gave specifics on some of the fruit's capabilities. Gingerly, Garp placed the book down, his hands still shaking, and he proceeded to. Wah ha 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 wah ha ha. Yees sss. Garp rose his fists overhead as his head shot straight up and he celebrated the moment. He jumped from his sitting position to stand on the tabletop. Everything matched perfectly, and for Garp the moment couldn't have been more joyous. If things went well, Luffy would grow up to become the best Marine ever. The image of Luffy wearing a large white Marine coat with the kanji for justice imprinted on the back and standing gloriously at the front of Marine headquarters entered Garp's mind. Garp jumped off of the table, leaving a sudden gust of wind that disturbed Makino's happy moment, and grabbed Luffy before blasting his fist right through the nearest wall and bolting through it with Luffy clasped in his arms. Makino stared for a second, with perplexed emotions as they faded into the distance. Makino watched while Luffy struggled in Garp's hold, through the large hole in the wall right next to the door. They reached a large meadow outside of town only a few minutes later. Luffy dropped out of Garp's clutch and landed awkwardly on his head, but shrugged it off a little and turned back to Garp. G-chan, why did you leave? Demanded as Garp stood tall. Luffy, from this day on, I will be doubling your training, Garp stated, proud authority in his voice. Luffy, however, was confused. Training? Garp smiled. Yes, I've just realized now that I have been too soft on you, throwing you into deep valleys. Luffy shivered. Tying you to balloons, Luffy stiffened immensely. And leaving you alone in dangerous forests isn't enough to make you a strong Marine. From now on. Garp clasped the knuckle of his right fist in his left hand and cracked it. I'm gonna show you some real training, Luffy gulped. The sunset on Fuchsia Island was always breathtaking to watch. The waves gently swishing upon the beach while the setting sun cast a magnificent orange glow over the island. In the middle of a large meadow on a hill overlooking the silent scene, however, Luffy dangled by his waist from a long rope tied to a tall tree. He was covered from head to toe in large bumps, bruises, and scratches. Luffy's nose was swollen and dried blood ran down his upper lip. Garp's fists also had a small bit of blood on them, but he stood with a proud smile on his face. Luffy swung lightly on the rope, taking deep and uneven breaths. His eyes were unable to be more than a little open due to the large bumps looming over his eyebrows and the rest of his body being sore and bruised. Garp wouldn't admit it, but he was more proud of his grandson now than he ever was before. Garp had beat on him like a punching bag for several straight hours, in multiple ways, and yet Luffy did not pass out. Garp couldn't have been more proud. In his mind's eye, he could see the future Luffy surpassing him in nearly every manner. Hey, Luffy. Let's go home, Garp said and turned his back to head back to Fuchsia. He froze in mid-step, however, when he heard Luffy's panting voice. G-chan, are you finally going to tell me what the book said? I've been wondering for a while now. Luffy spoke between deep pants. Garp stayed with his leg outstretched when Luffy finished. He'd been waiting for the right moment to tell Luffy all about what he'd discovered in the Devil Fruit book, and now was the perfect time to do so. Garp sighed before turning around, and faced Luffy, beaming happily. Luffy, you did indeed eat a logia fruit. Against my prior suspicions. Garp scratched his head. It is called the goro no Mi, or the rumble fruit. In time, it will allow you to turn into and control electricity," said Garp. Luffy's mouth curved into a slight smile, but with Luffy's almost shut eyes and bruises, it was almost comical to look at. Garp smiled, "Don't get too happy with yourself yet. Logia need a large amount of training to control their abilities and be able to change into their elements at a moment's notice. It will take a long time before you're able to utilize it effectively." Garp bumped his fists together and proclaimed, "Tomorrow, however, we're going to be doing some special training to help you along with mastering it." Garp let out a long laugh while Luffy frowned as he hung from the rope, a certain noise suddenly breaking the moment for the both of them. "Ji-chan, can we eat soon?" Luffy moaned. Garp dragged Luffy down to the meadow the next day. Garp was garbed in his usual white suit, only thing missing was the usual cape with the kanji for justice imprinted on the back. A semi-bandaged Luffy sat at Garp's feet as Garp scanned over the page Makino had found on the Goro no Mi. Suddenly Garp let out a loud, "Aha!" startling Luffy. "I found it. According to this book, the Goro no Mi's powers are measured in volts." Luffy's head rolled to the side. "Volts?" he questioned. Garp scratched his head in confusion as well. "Let's just say it's how the power of your attacks is measured. It seems that 200 million volts is the maximum power you can generate." Luffy's eyes widened slightly. "Wow," he said in awe. "Of course, it will take time for you to be able to control that much, so I've come up with an idea. You'll need to learn how to control the Goro no Mi, and I can think of no better way but through battle. That's why we're going to spar and see if that helps you awaken it." Garp put the book down and got in a fighting stance. "Come on Luffy, fight me with everything you've got. I'll even let you have the first move." Garp exclaimed, and Luffy shakily got to his knees and stood still for a second before charging at Garp. The spar was little more than Luffy being knocked back time and time again and Garp repeatedly pummeling him. Luffy would charge in with a punch, only for him to meet Garp's large fist and go tumbling back, and Garp charging in and delivering a punishing blow to Luffy's head or an uppercut. The process repeated itself several times, before something else happened. Bumps and bruises littered all over Luffy's body while Garp stood over and taunted him. "Bawahahaha! Is that all you got, Luffy? Come on, show me your spirit," Garp mocked as Luffy slowly rose to his feet. "Shut up, Ji-chan." Luffy rose to his feet and stood to face his grandpa once again. Garp gave a wide smile at his grandson before winding back as he prepared another punch. Luffy charged at Garp, his fist suddenly emitting sparks as he ran wildly. Their fists clashed in the middle of the meadow, Garp's fist easily sending Luffy flying back a few meters and sprawling over the ground. Garp, however, soon felt a powerful shock course through him. It wasn't anything major, but it definitely surprised Garp and caused his body to writhe a little bit until the shock subsided. Luffy was able to recover from being thrown back and saw the shock that rocked Garp's body for a few seconds. In slight awe, Luffy held his hand up and saw it sparking. "So this is what electricity is like," Luffy thought, feeling the electricity in his hand. Without thinking, Luffy filled his fist with a small amount of electricity and smiled as he did. Garp looked on, beaming proudly as his scruffy grandson. Even from Garp's vantage point, he could see that Luffy was steadily beginning to get the hang of the Goro no Mi. The shock caused by the last punch, though, put Garp on his guard. Now that Luffy was able to utilize some shocks, it meant that Garp would have to start using some tricks of his own. "Now then," Garp said, rolling the sleeves of his white jacket, "It's time to get serious." Garp charged his own fist with power and rushed Luffy once again. Luffy was put back on the defensive immediately, his grandfather's surprising speed catching him by surprise and rewarding Luffy with another large bump on his forehead and a trip through several more trees. The sparring went on and on, lasted until late noon when both of their stomachs grumbled loudly. Both of them looked at each other oddly, before turning around and heading back to Fuchsia village. Garp grasped Luffy by the back of the shoulder, his signature smile gracing his features along with a genuine look of pride. Luffy looked up at Garp and a smile broke from his face. They stood there for a few seconds, until Garp broke the silence. "Luffy, you're going to be a great Marine," earning another shout from Luffy. The next few days were filled with nothing but harsh and grueling training. Garp beat on Luffy relentlessly, having him run through the jungle, sparring, and throwing him into sinking marshes with his hands tied behind his back. With each passing day, Luffy grew stronger and stronger. Then, one day came. Luffy stood on the docks as a large group of pirates walked down a plank running from a large docked ship. Luffy's eyes were filled with awe. One man, however, caught Luffy's eye. He was a tall man wearing a straw hat over his head and a black coat over a white shirt that was buttoned halfway, and brown trousers with a red sash. Luffy also noticed of the 3 long scars that ran vertically over the man's left eye. With a burst of eager and excitement, Luffy followed the group of pirates into Makino's bar. They walked into the bar to an encore of loud shouts and cheering. It was immediately packed with bowdown several gallons of beer and rum. At the head of the bar sat the red-haired pirate along with the happy-faced Luffy. "Shanks, do you mind if I come with you next time? G-chan wants me to be a marine, but I want to be a pirate," the bubbly Luffy asked to the good-natured cheers from everyone in the bar. "Da ha 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 ha," Shanks laughed heartily. "What makes you think you can be a pirate?" he said. "Luffy, being a pirate is about more than how good of a swimmer you are. There's a lot more to it than that. You have to be strong like one too." A pirate with long blonde hair interjected. Luffy looked at the man, who was smirking slightly. My punch is as powerful as a pistol." Luffy punched his fist out. "Yes so," said Shanks. "What do you mean by that?" Luffy angrily shouted at Shanks. Luffy heard a big man suddenly say, "Luffy is still a kid." To which he immediately yelled, "I'm not a kid. I'm a man." Shanks smiled kindly and slid a glass of juice over to Luffy. "Here, have some juice," he said. Luffy smiled with delight and grabbed the glass and gulped down a large swallow. Shanks started howling with laughter, slapping the table. "See? You're still a kid," Shanks said amidst more jeers of laughter and angry shouts and name-calling from Luffy. Shanks laughed loudly among the other bar patrons, before coming to a stop. He looked over at a large amount of boards, poorly nailed over the wall. Shanks scratched his head for a moment before turning around and looking at Makino. "Excuse me, Makino. Have you been robbed recently?" Shanks asked politely. Makino stood back a little bit. "No, we weren't." "Why?" she said questioningly. Shanks was a little perturbed at the answer. "It's nothing. But a lot of us assumed there were just some renovations going on. But now I'm wondering. How did a large hole get in the wall right next to the door?" he asked while pointing oddly at the boarded over wall. Makino smiled politely while also having a large sweat bead roll down her forehead. "You really don't want to know." Shanks looked at her for a second, and looked at the wall, then shrugged and went back to his drink. A loud bang suddenly echoed throughout the bar, causing everyone inside to become completely silent as a small gang of men marched in through the door, most clad in white uniforms, with an odd man wearing a brown trench coat leading the way. He had dark black hair with a goatee and a black fuzz covering his upper lip. The man also had slitted eyes and wore a golden necklace. "So this is what passes for pirates these days, huh? Pathetic." The lead man spoke with contempt in his voice. "Welcome, gentlemen." Makino spoke in a polite tone. "What can I get for you?" "We're mountain bandits. Don't worry, however, we won't destroy your place. All we need is a few barrels of sake and we won't cause any trouble," the large man said. "I'm sorry, but whatever sake I had left in stock is all out there," Makino responded politely. The bandit, however, wasn't convinced and scoffed a little at Makino. Shanks looked up from his meal, his usual calmness unchanged. "Sorry guys, looks like me and my men drank all the alcohol, but..." Shanks held up a bottle of sake. "You can have this if you want. It hasn't even been opened yet, so go ahead." The bandit reached up with an open hand, seemingly intent to take the offered bottle, when his hand clenched into a fist and shattered the bottle to pieces, spilling the contents all over the red-haired pirate. "Do you take me for a fool? I'm a wanted man, worth 8 million belly. A single bottle won't be enough for even me, much less my men," the large man shrugged. Shanks, however, remained silent and unflinching at the large amount of sake soaking his clothes. Now the floor is all wet. I'm sorry, Makino," Shanks said apologetically as he hurriedly began gathering up the mess. "No worries, I'll get a broom." Makino rushed around the bar to the closet where she kept the broom, when she heard a loud crash. The contents of the various drinks spilled onto the floor and the dishes laid cracked at the end of the bar counter, slashed by the bandit's sword. Shanks sat up against the broken counter, still dripping with sake, while the man sheathed his sword. "Since you like cleaning things up so much, you should enjoy this even more," mocked the bandit, before turning around. "Let's go. There is no use being here if they don't have any sake," the man said, and walking out the swinging door, followed by the rest of the men. Luffy sat at the bar, seething with anger, while the bar remained as silent as a graveyard. Makino kneeled beside Shanks, who still sat at the foot of a bar stool. "Are you hurt anywhere?" Makino questioned worriedly. "Don't worry, I'm fine," he waved off in a carefree manner. For a second, the bar maintained complete silence, the only sound being the squeaking of the lone door hinges. Then the laughter started, followed by jeering and the sound of more drinking. Shanks loosed a wide grin before also breaking out laughing while Makino wiped the sake off his drenched shirt. "Why are you laughing? That wasn't cool. Why didn't you fight back?" Luffy resounded angrily, bringing the loud laughter to a stop once more. Luffy shouted, his voice carrying over the entire bar. Shanks only stared at Luffy, his face unreadable. "It's not that I don't understand your feelings, but they only spilled a bit of sake. It isn't worth getting angry about," Shanks calmly said, his demeanor unchanged. "I don't care anymore." Luffy turned back to face the bar counter, his upper lip quivering as he did so. Just as he was about to sit down once more, Luffy's gaze caught something else sighting in a chest a few inches from him. Much to Luffy's surprise, it was a moderately sized round fruit. It was bluish in color, but what surprised Luffy were the squiggle S designs on the fruit. They were just like the designs on the fruit that he'd found. Curiously, he picked the fruit up and looked at it for a second. Besides the shape of it, the designs were almost completely the same. Questions overwhelmed Luffy. Would he gain another power if he ate another fruit? What would he get if he ate this one? Luffy opened his mouth to take a bite, his jaw clamping down to rip off a piece. Shanks adjusted his straw hat while Makino meticulously wiped the spilled sake off his shirt. For a second, Shanks' eyes wandered back to Luffy sitting at the bar. It was at that moment that he saw Luffy holding the Gomu Gomu no Mi on the bar counter and his jaw clamping down to take a bite. Shanks reacted with great speed, jumping to his feet and snatching the fruit from Luffy's grasp, just as his jaw shut all the way down. Luffy, puzzled at the disappearance, paused before looking to his left at Shanks, who clenched the fruit in his right hand tightly. "No, Luffy. You can't eat this," Shanks yelled loudly while Luffy just stared at him. "Why?" Luffy said, his wide eyes blinking. "This is the Gomu Gomu no Mi, also known as a devil's fruit. One bite and your body would have become rubber, but you would have never been able to swim again," Shanks scolded Luffy. "Yeah, so?" Luffy replied, causing Shanks to pause and blink for a second. "I've eaten one of those fruits already. I just wanted to see if it would give me another cool power like the first one did," Luffy said with excitement evident. Shanks remained silent, lost for words. To say he was taken by surprise would be an understatement. Most people in East Blue have only heard rumors about devil fruits, yet here was a kid who was not only not surprised by it, but even admitted that he'd eaten a devil fruit before. How did Luffy manage to eat one? Shanks thought for a moment. Luffy looked at Shanks oddly before speaking. "Yeah, I found one on the beach after while I was in the forest with Jii-chan." Luffy stared innocently while Shanks sweated a little bit. No, that's impossible. Devil fruits aren't native in East Blue or any blue, they're usually found in the Grand Line. Finding one on a random beach in East Blue is impossible," Shanks said disbelievingly as his eyes closed. "You couldn't possibly have found one here. We even had to fight a whole lot just to find this one." Shanks turned to the rest of the pirates that occupied the bar, who were also stunned at Luffy's remark and passive response. Luffy didn't flinch though. "It's true. It had the same swirly marks as that one and it even looked a lot like it. When I fought Jii-chan, I also made sparks come out of my hands. Watch." Luffy concentrated a little bit, before his hands suddenly sparked and his hands were soon engulfed in blue-colored electricity. Everyone, with the exception of Luffy, suddenly jaw dropped while their eyes faded in complete and total disbelief. Even Shanks was left completely lost for words. It seemed impossible, yet here it was, right in front of them. Shanks' eyes receded while the electricity danced around Luffy's right hand, before coming to a stop. For a while, the bar was silent before the mutterings started. Unbelievable. H how did he? And WW what the heck? Came as some of the most common. Luffy kept his eyes focused on Shanks. So, Shanks. Can I join your pirate crew? Luffy asked excitedly. Shanks still stood in shock for a second before sitting down and pulling the rim of his straw hat over his eyes for a moment. Luffy. It's true that you've surprised me here, but being a pirate is very dangerous. Even with your powers, you'd still be in constant danger. In fact, your powers might even put you in more danger. You don't have any more control over your powers than that, right? Unskilled devil fruit users are usually picked off first since they can't fully control their power. That or worse. Shanks spoke solemnly, before being interrupted. Then I'll get stronger, I'll get better with handling it and then. Luffy's brief hope was crushed when a loud crash from Shanks smashing a fist into the bar counter interrupted him. Luffy. There are times when raw strength just isn't enough. You can be as powerful as you want, but there are enemies that you just can't beat with just brute force. Shanks said calmly, with a gentle smile, before setting his hand over Luffy, you'll understand someday. Luffy. Shanks spoke reverently, with both pride and worry. Luffy looked up at Shanks, standing proudly, and Luffy couldn't help but feel a little bit of awe. It was only a second later that Luffy pouted and crossed his arms over his chest, as Shanks gave a warm-hearted smile and the shouting and chaos of the bar resumed. Don't make fun of Shanks and his crew, you mountain monkey, Luffy shouted at the large man, startling the group of bandits. Mikino's bar suddenly became very quiet as the bandits looked up from their drinks to see a very angry Luffy. Shanks and his crew aren't cowards, you stupid bandits, Luffy yelled angrily. Slowly, the man in the trench coat stood up and hastily walked over to Luffy. Enraged, Luffy jumped at the tall man, intent on taking a large bite out of the man's arm. In mid-flight, the bandit swatted Luffy with his right arm and sent him flying over the bar and crashing through the wood of the recently repaired door. Luffy yelled loudly, his head bouncing over the wood before landing face first in the dirt outside. The impact jarred him a little, but it was nothing that Luffy wasn't used to. He slowly started to get up, barely phased, when he was suddenly grabbed from behind. The large bandit and several of the other bandits exited the bar, and one had seized Luffy by his shirt neck. Luffy began struggling violently against the bandit's grasp, but to no avail. Luffy soon found himself facing the large bandit with the brown trench coat. What a hopeless little kid. The tall man wistfully drew the cutlass sword from the scabbard that hung by his hip under his trench coat and held it outstretched at Luffy's neck. You know I can't let anyone who's pissed me off live. Too bad for you, little brat, said Higuma in a slightly somber tone. Luffy continued to struggle against the grip of the bandit and being rewarded with several punches to the gut for his trouble. Luffy hung for a second as the man drew back the blade from Luffy's neck. Still struggling, Luffy wriggled and wretched in the bandit's grasp until he reached behind and grabbed the hand of the bandit holding his shirt collar. Higuma began to bring the sword around, in a slicing arc, when something happened that surprised him. The bandit holding the brat by the collar suddenly started shaking wildly and screaming from what appeared to be electricity coming from the brat's fingers, which were now emitting a large amount of sparks. The shocks lasted a second or two before stopping, leaving the bandit burnt and semi-conscious. Luffy removed his hands and fell while the bandit slumped to the ground, out like a light. Higuma had always heard of the numerous legends that surrounded devil fruits, but Higuma wasn't a bandit to believe in rumors and legends. He always dismissed them as foolish gossip and old stories. What he just witnessed, however, was enough to convince him that the rumors weren't just meaningless gospel. Luffy stood facing the bandit, his fists now actively emitting sparks while the awestruck bandits encircling the two looked on with faces of disbelief. Higuma maintained his composure, dropping his arm back to his side. Without warning, Higuma began to laugh. Oh, this is just rich. A little kid with the power of the devil fruit, Higuma said between bursts of laughter. Hey, stop laughing. What's so funny? Luffy questioned at the laughing bandit. Higuma seemingly started to regain control. I'll tell you what's so funny, finding a little squirt like you with the devil fruit power. I don't know whether this is pure luck or dumb coincidence. Higuma broke from his laughter and nodded his head slightly at a nearby bandit. You want to learn something, kid? Devil fruits are dangerous. I even met a few who have powers just like yours, Higuma said. Really? Luffy's head fell a little bit as he said it. Really, they were really strong. Higuma praised, but there was always one thing about them. Higuma glanced maliciously over at the bandit who now carried a small bucket full of water. Luffy saw the glance however and quickly turned toward it, but he was too late. He was soon completely drenched from head to toe in water from the well. Luffy sputtered and spat while Higuma resumed laughing. They couldn't use their powers while they were wet. Higuma laughed while Luffy began struggling again from the grasp of the bandit. Luffy kicked and struggled against the binding grip, but to no avail. A swift punch struck him hard in the stomach, driving the wind from his lungs and making his body go limp. He was then thrown roughly onto the ground against the well. Higuma held his sword to Luffy's neck once more while holding him down with his boot and prepared to kill him. "Shame I have to kill you, kid, but I don't let anyone piss me off and live," Higuma said. Luffy felt the blade brush against his neck, as Higuma prepared to bring the blade down in a chopping arc. "Wait a minute," a voice cried from behind them. The bandits turned around casually to find an old man, dressed in a yellow t-shirt and striped pants carrying a cane followed by the young barmaid from the tavern. Both also seemed to be out of breath. "Don't hurt that kid, I don't know what he did to you, but please let him go, we'll even pay you, so I beg you, please." Astonishingly to Luffy, the mayor then bowed on the ground, his knees and face both on the ground. Higuma turned his gaze to the old man and turned back, paying little heed to the old man. "Your kind always know what to say, but not this time. I'm not one to let people off just because their kids are for money." Pinned down by the weight of the bandit, Luffy could only struggle against the boot and throw insults at the large man. The mayor of Fushia village looked on, begging for the man to let Luffy go when another voice spoke. "I wondered why no one was at the bar, if it isn't the bandit from before." Everyone was surprised to find the large group of pirates standing proudly behind them, led by the red-haired pirate from before, wearing wide smile. "Luffy, I thought your punch was as powerful as a pistol." Luffy shouted at Shanks to be quiet. The large bandit, however, glanced at Shanks from his peripheral vision, before another in the group stepped up and placed a gun to the pirate's head. "This pistol isn't a toy, someone could get hurt." Shanks lightly tutted to the bandit. Before the bandit could think much on it, however, a gunshot sounded, causing the bandit to drop to the ground, lifeless. The bandit sweated in shock as a brief silence overcame the moment. The bandits began crying foul while the pirates stood proudly. "Unfair, you're not fighting against holy men." "No, we are pirates," the pirates said. Feeling threatened, the bandits backed up nervously. "Listen closely, bandits. I can have food and drink spilled all over me or even spat it and I'll laugh about it. However," Shanks's tone shifted suddenly from calm to outrage, "I will never forgive anyone who hurts a friend of mine, for any reason whatsoever." Higuma laughed loudly before loudly ordering the bandits to kill them. The bandits let loose a loud outcry before charging straight at them. "I'll handle it. I'm more than enough," the man standing right behind Shanks said, then proceeded to calmly walk forward and draw the rifle that holstered by his side. Swinging it in a large arc, he then beat down the white-clad men with casual ease. "If you want to fight us, then I suggest you bring a battleship next time," the man proudly declared, aiming the long rifle at the now alone Higuma. Luffy marveled at his strength while Higuma began breaking out in a cold sweat, asking to talk. "Isn't there a bounty on your head?" Shanks said with haste before Higuma, sweating profusely, withdrew a smoke bomb from within his jacket and vanished. When the smoke cleared, both Luffy and Higuma were nowhere to be seen. "Luffy!" Shanks cried out before panicking. "Shit, he took Luffy, what should we do, everyone?" While Lucky Roo calmed Shanks down, the man known as Ben Beckman let out RLD seemed to slow down as Higuma casually tossed Luffy into the ocean. Luffy, still too wet to emit any electricity and powerless to do anything, splashed into the water and immediately started drowning. Higuma laughed loudly at the young boy's cries for help until a large shadow overhead gave him pause. A large shriek was all that Higuma had time to do before he vanished into the beast's giant maw along with the small boat. Luffy wildly thrashed about in the water, crying out for help in a garbled voice, but the Sea King raced at Luffy, preparing to swallow him whole. Luffy yelled out in fear before he was pushed aside from the bite and held inside the ensuing wave. Luffy remained in shocked silence as he turned his head to see Shanks held in the current with him. The large Sea King surfaced soon after before it was bombarded with an overwhelming force. For a moment, the Sea King was lost in the eyes of the red-haired man. Feeling the power emit from him caused the beast to break out in a cold sweat. As soon as it subsided a little, the beast dove underwater and swam away. "Thank you, Luffy, I owe you one. Makino told me everything, you stood up to them for us." Luffy held in tears, shakily gripping Shanks while he stroked his hand through Luffy's hair. "Hey, don't cry. You're a grown-up, but, Shanks, your arm." Luffy cried out. Shanks' coat was ripped at just below his left shoulder, revealing the missing arm. Blood poured from the wound and was quickly washed away with the tide. "It's just an arm, you don't need to worry," Shanks said warmly, while tears began falling down Luffy's eyes and grief and sadness overcome the young boy. The day soon came when it was time for the crew to depart. Luffy stood on the docks as they loaded various supplies onto the ship. After a little taunting from Shanks, Luffy began a loud outburst. "No matter what, I will become the Pirate King," Luffy shouted at Shanks and the red-haired pirates while they watched from the docks with boxes of supplies. Shanks smiled lightly and took off his favorite straw hat before proudly placing it on Luffy's head. "I'll let you look after this hat. It's my favorite and very important." Luffy's eyes dripped with tears for a few seconds while they finished loading the supplies and moved to stand with the rest of the townspeople who took part to wave goodbye. Luffy grasped Shanks' straw hat shakily and watched as the ship faded into the distance. "Someday. Return it to me. As a great pirate, it's a promise, Luffy." A few days later, Luffy was running an errand for Makino in the middle of town when a large hand suddenly grabbed him by the throat and constricted around in a rough manner, though leaving enough room for him to breathe a little. Luffy struggled a little bit before he looked up and a hoarse voice spoke. "Been getting a little too comfortable, have you, Luffy?" the voice said. Luffy stared up into the large grinning face of his grandpa, Monkey D. Garp. A cold sweat suddenly dropped down Luffy's forehead while Garp gripped him tightly by his neck. He was wearing a black outfit rather than his usual one and the vice grip seemed to be tighter than Garp usually held him with. "Luffy, it seems that I won't be able to train you into a fine marine myself. It seems Sengoku won't allow me to take time off and won't buy anything I say to him as well as keep sticking me with the marine policy to leave all family at home as his main reason. So I've decided to leave you with a friend of mine," Garp said before turning around and walking down the middle road of town with a struggling Luffy held firmly in his hand and the townspeople giving him a wide berth. Just as Garp was about to set out for Mount Corvo, he suddenly stopped in mid-step and his jaw dropped and his eyes widened. "Oh, that's right, I forgot," Garp said in surprise. Luffy ceased struggling when he heard this and felt Garp turn the other direction and walk down the path for a few minutes until they reached a very familiar tree. The very sight of the tree caused Luffy to suddenly start struggling harder. "I need to ensure that you don't start slacking off. Luffy. You must become one of the greatest marines ever. To do that, you'll need to build endurance." Garp cracked his knuckles while Luffy struggled against the rope that now kept him tied by his waist to the hanging branch. "And I know just the perfect way to build it. I don't want to be a marine, I want to be a pirate. Like Shanks, and become the Pirate King," Luffy argued while still struggling to get free of the ropes. Garp's face began to turn an inexplicable shade of red. "Pirate King, Shanks, you will do no such thing." Luffy gritted his teeth as Garp wound his fist up and threw punches in rapid succession. Even though he was tempted to do so by Garp, every time Luffy was threatened by Garp, he never said he would give up on being the Pirate King, though suffering quite a lot more for each remark. Garp walked down the path on Mount Corvo with an unconscious Luffy hanging by his shirt in Garp's fist and covered in bruises and blood. They traipsed through the thickets and groves of Mount Corvo. Garp held Luffy by the scruff of his dark blue 56 sleeveless t-shirt while Luffy continued to grunt and struggle. He occasionally would try to shock Garp by reaching to grab Garp's hand, but Garp immediately saw it each time and slapped it away before rewarding him with another sore bump on his head. Luffy continued to struggle for most of the way, biting and gripping various objects in attempts to free himself but to little or no success. Try as he might to channel the electricity through his shirt, but couldn't from anywhere but his hands. "Let me go, G-chan." Luffy would cry out as he hung awkwardly by his shirt. "I promised Shanks that I would be the king of the pirates." "Cut it with the pirate crap." Garp rebuffed Luffy while they continued up the trail. "On top of eating a logia-type devil fruit, you talk nonsense." Garp acclaimed loudly, "Luffy, I won't allow you to become a pirate. You must become the strongest Navy Marine. Befriending that red hair, bah, you idiot." The rant eventually died down once Luffy stopped struggling, but he still hung by his shirt uncomfortably. The air soon became quiet as they walked through Mount Corvo. "You'll be staying with a friend for a little while and I'll be back when I can to check on you regularly and pick you up when it's time." Garp trailed off, leaving Luffy puzzled while he stared up at his grandfather. Time for what?" Luffy questioned, though Garp turned his head in the other direction and seemed to be thinking heavily. "Well," Garp began very hesitantly, before his expression and tone changed. "Oh, I forgot to tell you, Luffy." Garp suddenly shifted in tone and looked down into the baffled face of Luffy. "There is someone else that will be staying with you while you're there. She was a very good person the last time I saw her, so the two of you should get along well. After all, she's your adopted sister, so be a good boy." "Sister?" Luffy asked questioningly to himself. They walked until they came to a large wooden house. Luffy stayed behind while Garp knocked on the door. "Hello, Dayton," Garp shouted while Luffy examined the poorly built shack. "What is this place?" Luffy said before running around to explore a little. The door suddenly burst open with a loud yell, as the very angry Dayton slammed the door open in rage, before a very scary mean glare from Garp silenced her. Garp-san." Dayton reeled back in fright as Dogra and Mogra emerged from the curtain door, also in a frightened state. "You're looking rather well," Garp commented casually. "Give me a break. Please have mercy on me. That devil of a child Anna is 10 years old already." Dayton pleaded desperately while Dogra attempted to reason with Garp. "Putting that aside," Garp began to say, prompting an angry response from Dogra. Dayton continued to watch Luffy chase a dragonfly before yelling at him. Garp grabbed the back of the neck of Luffy's shirt and held him up high. "Look after him for a while too," Garp said nonchalantly with Luffy dangling in his left hand. Dayton and both Mogra and Dogra were left silent. "Luffy, say hello," Garp prompted, earning a quick, "yo," from Luffy. "Who is that kid?" Mogra asked silently. His answer was probably both the least expected and the least welcomed. "He is my grandson," Garp answered. A brief moment of silence ensued before all three bandits burst out with loud shouts and howls of surprise. "We cannot take him," all three sternly replied at the same time. Garp stood in front of them with his arms crossed in front of his chest. All three broke out in a cold sweat as Garp used his own methods of persuasion. Meanwhile, the dragonfly teetered and tottered along in the wind while Luffy gave chase. A subtle giggling noise from the forest a short distance away broke his carefree chase, and he stopped in his tracks to stare at what seemed to be the source of the noise. Shadowed underneath the trees, Luffy spotted a small girl. She sat on top of a large animal, carrying a long pole, and was dressed in a sleeveless orange shirt and yellow skirt. Her face was slightly obscured by the shadow of the trees towering above her. Garp momentarily ceased his torture of Dayton, Mogra, and Dogra and turned to politely greet the young girl. "Anna," Garp politely exclaimed and walked over. "Luffy, this is Anna. She's 3 years older than you. You'll be living with them from now on." Dayton angrily stood up to protest, but Garp silenced them all with a deathly leer. "We'll take him," all of them said simultaneously. "Good," Garp said politely before walking up to them as they stood upright. Much to their surprise, he then leaned over and began whispering to Dayton behind his left hand. "Don't tell Luffy this, but I'm thinking of only leaving him here for 3 years," Garp whispered to Dayton quietly. Dayton was greatly surprised by this and wanted to inquire further but waited patiently while Garp continued. "I'll be back to pick him up then." Garp lowered his hand and began to stride away before he felt Dayton put a firm grip on his shoulder. "Hold on a second, why only 3 years? We've raised Anna for a lot longer than that, so why can't you take her with you?" Dayton pleaded. hoping for a desperately needed reprieve from dealing with numerous traps and falls of raising the child of the devil himself. Garp turned around and began whispering again, "I'm not at liberty to discuss it, but it's something that could change everything. I can hardly get off from work with Sengoku though, and Luffy needs to find his own way and gain experience and strength. I'm leaving it up to you to just watch over him until he's grown up enough. I'll be back from time to time to check on him and see how he's progressing," Garp said in a hushed and covered voice Dayton before she relinquished her grip on Garp's shoulder and he walked down the road. Dayton, however, let out a slight gasp at the old man as he walked back into the forest and seemingly reached out to speak again. Garp began